When Blaise Pascal died in Paris in 1662, a servant noticed something unusual in the lining of his coat. Sewn into the fabric were two small folded sheets, one of parchment, the other of paper. They carried the same hurried words, a private record of an experience Pascal had undergone nearly 8 years earlier. The document began with a cross, followed by a date and a span of time. November 23, 1654, from about 10:30 at night until around midnight midnight. Then came a single word: fire. Below it, Pascal had written, "God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and scholars." The page would later become known as the Memorial. Pascal appears to have kept it close, transferring it from one coat to another, while telling almost no one what had happened during those 2 hours. It did not reveal that he had secretly been religious. His religious commitments were well known. What it revealed was something more intimate, the incandescent center of those commitments, the memory of an encounter he did not want to lose. But the language is startling. This was one of the greatest mathematical minds in European history. Pascal had helped lay the foundations of probability theory. He had designed a mechanical calculator, conducted important experiments on atmospheric pressure, and made brilliant contributions to geometry. Yet when he tried to name what he had found at the center of reality, he set the God he had encountered against the God of the philosophers and scholars. Why would a genius of reason draw such a boundary around reason itself? And what does that boundary tell us about the most famous argument attached to his name, Pascal's wager? The wager is often remembered as a kind of celestial insurance policy. Believe in God, the simplified version says, because the possible reward is infinite and the possible loss is small. If God exists, belief gains heaven. If God does not exist, little has been sacrificed. It is clever, cold, and apparently calculating, the sort of argument one might expect from a mathematician. But placed back inside Pascal's thought, the wager becomes both more interesting and more unsettling. Rather than proving that God exists or frightening unbelievers into church, it forms part of a much larger argument about the reach of reason, the formation of belief, and the difference between thinking about God and knowing God. Welcome to History Dives. This is not a biography of Pascal so much as the history of a question. Can faith be reasonable? And if it can faith itself be reached through reason alone? If you enjoy thoughtful stories from intellectual history, subscribe. There are many more to come. Pascal was born in 1623, into the first great century of modern science. This was not a simple passage from faith into secular reason. Many of the architects of the scientific revolution were devout Christians. The deeper change concerned method. Nature increasingly appeared susceptible to measurement, experiment, and mathematical description. Old authorities could be questioned. Complex phenomena could be reduced to laws. The universe was beginning to look not merely ordered, but legible. Few people were better equipped to read it than Pascal. As a teenager, he produced original work on conic sections. Still in his teens, he began constructing the machine later called the Pascaline, designed to help his father perform laborious tax calculations. In his 20s, he pursued experiments that challenged the ancient belief that nature could not tolerate a vacuum, and helped establish the role of atmospheric pressure. In 1654, while corresponding with Pierre de Fermat over a problem involving an interrupted game of chance, Pascal helped create the mathematical foundations of probability. That last achievement matters. The man remembered for turning belief into a wager did not borrow the language of probability as a decoration. He was one of the people who taught Europe how to reason rigorously about uncertainty. Pascal, therefore, did not distrust reason because he was incapable of it. He distrusted its imperial ambitions because he knew its power from within. He had watched mathematics extract order from gambling, machines relieve human calculation, and experiments force nature to answer carefully framed questions. He knew what a disciplined method could accomplish. He also knew that a successful method can tempt us into mistaking its reach for the reach of reality. No thinker stood closer to that temptation, or embodied its grandeur more fully, than René Descartes. Descartes was 27 years older than Pascal, and his project helped define the intellectual atmosphere in which the younger man came of age. He sought a foundation for knowledge that could survive radical doubt. Beginning with the indubitable fact of his own thinking, he tried to reconstruct the world through clear and distinct ideas. God was not absent from that system. On the contrary, Descartes argued that a non-deceiving God guaranteed that the mind's clearest perceptions could be trusted. God, in other words, was required to secure the intelligibility of the entire system. Pascal's complaint was subtler than the claim that Descartes simply rejected God. It was that the Cartesian God seemed in danger of becoming a component in an intellectual machine, necessary to establish the system, but thereafter strangely remote once the system began to run. "I cannot forgive Descartes," Pascal wrote. Descartes, he said, would gladly have dispensed with God altogether, except that he needed God to give the cosmos its first push. After that, Pascal complained, he has no further need of God. The criticism is polemical and not entirely fair. God remained important within Descartes' philosophy, but the charge reveals Pascal's deeper fear. A God required mainly to secure an explanation can be acknowledged without being loved, obeyed, or even remembered. He can become the necessary premise in a proof, while leaving the person who accepts it perfectly unchanged. For Pascal, that was not knowledge of God in any adequate sense. If God were merely one more object in the universe, then perhaps we could investigate him as we investigate the geometry of a circle or the motion of the stars. We could gather the relevant facts, infer the right conclusion, and move on. But the God of Christianity is not supposed to be one object among others. God is the source of every object, every mind, and every good. To know such a God would not simply add one more fact to a collection. It would draw the collector himself inside the question. The discovery would change the discoverer. This is the force of the memorial's contrast. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is personal, a God who enters history and is known through human dependence, relationship, sacrifice, and love. He does not merely occupy a place at the beginning or end of a proof. He makes a claim upon the person doing the reasoning. Pascal was not saying that the God of Abraham is irrational. He was drawing a stark distinction between an argument about God and an encounter with God. To explain why, Pascal reaches for one of the most misunderstood words in his writing, the heart. "The heart has its reasons," he famously wrote, "of which reason knows nothing." To modern ears, this sounds like a slogan printed beneath a sunset. Stop thinking so much, trust your feelings, and follow wherever desire leads. But we must keep in mind that Pascal wrote more than a century before the Romantic era, before Western culture learned to speak so readily of feeling, instinct, and private emotion as alternatives to reason. Pascal's heart is not a burst of sentiment, nor an excuse to believe whatever one feels. It names the deeper faculty by which a person recognizes what matters, what he commits himself to, and how he comes to know realities that cannot be held at arm's length. Pascal uses the word to describe a more basic way human beings apprehend reality before they begin to argue about it. His examples include first principles: space, time, motion, and number. Reason does not prove these from some still deeper set of conclusions. It begins with them. We grasp the principles first, then reason demonstrates what follows. Every argument must begin somewhere. Reason can carry us from premises to conclusions, test whether the steps between them are valid, and reveal what our commitments imply. But it cannot establish every premise through a prior argument without entering an endless regress. The why of it all has to end somewhere. Or, to be more accurate, it has to begin somewhere. Somewhere, the mind must encounter truths it does not first deduce. For Pascal, we apprehend those beginnings through the faculty he calls the heart. Reason is powerful. Pascal understood this better than almost anyone. But reason is not self-starting. Before we decide how to pursue something, it must first appear worth pursuing. Before we compare justice and advantage, we must already perceive that both have weight. Reason can refine our judgments, expose a false good, or show that our values contradict one another. But it never surveys the world from nowhere. It operates within a life in which some things already command attention, some things appear precious, and others barely register at all. This does not make the heart infallible. Human beings can love badly. We can become so trained by comfort, status, resentment, or distraction that the trivial appears urgent and the important becomes invisible. Pascal's writings are filled with precisely this anxiety. Much of human life, he thought, is organized to keep us from seeing ourselves clearly. We seek diversion not merely because amusement is pleasant, but because silence might confront us with our mortality, our dependence, and our hunger for a happiness the world cannot secure. The heart can therefore be disordered, but that does not mean we can replace it with pure calculation, because calculation itself must serve some end. A perfect map cannot tell us where we ought to go unless something first matters enough to become a destination. This is why Pascal's account cannot be reduced to a contest between feelings and facts. The heart does not cancel reason. It supplies some of the ground from which reasoning begins, and some of the ends for which reasoning matters. Reason can then discipline the heart, just as the heart gives reason direction. Each can correct the other. Neither makes the other unnecessary. So when Pascal says that the heart knows God, he is making a claim about the kind of knowledge involved. He is not suggesting that a passing intuition is proof of divine existence. He is saying that if God is known, God will not be known merely as the last term in a chain of deductions. Identifying the limits of reason does not prove that God exists. Pascal's point is narrower. If reason cannot produce communion with God, the failure may reveal a limit in the method rather than an absence in reality. That is the intellectual setting in which the wager must be read. During the final years of his life, Pascal accumulated notes for a defense of Christianity, an apology in the older sense of a reasoned defense. He never completed it. After his death at 39, his family and associates gathered the fragments, and a first edition appeared in 1670 under the title by which the collection is now known, the Pensées, or Thoughts. The Pensées are not a finished manuscript with a settled sequence. They are remnants of a book that never reached its final form. Arguments, images, headings, dialogues, and compressed observations arranged in bundles whose intended architecture remains disputed. We should therefore be cautious whenever someone claims to have recovered the one definitive meaning of Pascal's wager. We possess a brilliant fragment, not Pascal's completed argument. But the fragment contains a movement, and that movement is frequently lost when the wager is reduced to its payoff table. Pascal is not speaking primarily to a confident believer or a contented atheist. His imagined reader is suspended between them. This person cannot dismiss Christianity, but cannot affirm it either. He sees too much uncertainty to believe, and too much at stake to stop wondering. He may even want to believe, yet finds that wanting insufficient. Pascal begins on the ground this reader trusts: reason. God either exists or does not, he says, and reason cannot decide the question with certainty. Faced with that uncertainty, the reader proposes what appears to be the prudent course: do not wager. Pascal refuses the escape. You must wager, he replies. It is not optional, you are embarked. Life is already underway. Our choices, habits, loyalties, and omissions are shaping us while the argument remains unsettled. We cannot occupy a permanent viewing platform outside existence until every question has been answered. To live as though God does not matter is also a way of staking a life. Refusing to choose does not preserve neutrality. It allows an unexamined choice to continue choosing us. Only then does Pascal introduce the mathematics. If the possible gain is infinite life with God, while the stake is a finite earthly life, then even uncertainty can make commitment rational. He considers the balance of gain and loss with the audacity of the mathematician he was. The calculation is real. It should not be explained away as though Pascal never meant it. But it is not the end of the dialogue. The reader does not respond, "Your arithmetic has converted me." He says, in effect, that the argument may be compelling while belief remains impossible. "I am so made that I cannot believe. What then would you have me do?" If the wager was simply a command to select the profitable proposition, Pascal could answer, "Choose belief." But belief is not a switch the will can flip after examining the odds. A person cannot sincerely believe that God exists merely because belief would be advantageous. Pascal therefore advises the reader to learn from people who once stood in the same uncertainty and began to live differently, to pray, to worship, and to enter the practices through which belief becomes part of a life. This advice can sound scandalous. Is Pascal recommending self-deception, telling a skeptic to repeat religious gestures until judgment gives way? The danger is real. Habits can form people into error as easily as truth. Participation is not a guarantee, and no ritual should be immune from examination merely because it transforms those who perform it. But human conviction is never formed by disembodied logic alone. We are creatures of practice. What we repeatedly do tutors our attention, and what we attend to shapes what we are capable of seeing. Some realities become intelligible only through the disciplines that make us receptive to them. That does not mean practice creates the reality. Music is not beautiful merely because we rehearse it, and God does not come into existence because someone begins to pray. Participation changes the knower. It does not manufacture the thing known. Pascal did not think such practices could manufacture faith. They could only prepare the seeker to receive what argument could not produce. The wager therefore asks whether uncertainty justifies remaining permanently outside a form of life that might disclose what spectatorship cannot. Reason can open the door. It cannot tell us what it is like to walk through it. The argument carries the seeker as far as reason can take him, not to possession, but to participation, not to certainty, but to a responsible next step. This interpretation does not rescue the wager from every objection. Most obviously, the calculation alone cannot establish Christianity. If all we possess is a table containing finite losses and infinite rewards, why wager on Pascal's God rather than some other deity, or any imagined power promising an infinite return? Isolated from historical and theological claims, the mathematical form can be repurposed almost without limit. That is a genuine weakness if the wager is presented as a complete proof. But the surviving pensées range far beyond the wager, examining the divided human condition, Christ, scripture, history, and humanity's strange mixture of greatness and misery. The wager cannot tell the reader which religion is true. At most, it can challenge the assumption that uncertainty makes serious religious inquiry irrational. A wager can make the journey worth beginning. It cannot by itself determine the destination. There is also the charge that the argument makes faith mercenary. Does it turn worship into a bargain, with heaven as the prize and religious practice as the entrance fee? A crude presentation deserves that criticism, but near the end of the fragment, Pascal describes the earthly result in moral rather than hedonistic terms. The person becomes faithful, honest, humble, grateful, generous, sincere, and truthful. He begins, Pascal says, to gain in this life. For Pascal, the promised gain extends beyond pleasure stretched across endless time. It means a transformed capacity for the good. The question is whether our present way of living is ordered toward what can actually fulfill a human being. This still will not satisfy every critic. Other traditions can also claim that participation deepens perception. Practice can reveal, it can also reinforce. The honest seeker must remain capable of self-criticism, of listening to rival claims, and of distinguishing encounter from the comfort of belonging. Pascal offers no mechanical procedure that eliminates those risks. That is partly his point. The demand for a method that guarantees the right answer before we commit anything of ourselves may be impossible in questions that concern the whole self. Love, loyalty, vocation, and trust all require judgment under conditions that fall short of proof. We do not escape the risk of error by refusing them. We risk a different kind of error, constructing a life around the refusal to be claimed. Faith, on this account, is not unreasonable. It is also not the inevitable conclusion of an argument. That distinction is the center of Pascal's thought. Reason can examine whether faith is coherent. It can expose superstition, challenge contradiction, compare testimony, and ask whether a tradition's claims survive scrutiny. Pascal had no desire to abolish those tasks. He wrote that if religion submitted everything to reason, it would lose its mystery. But if it offended the principles of reason, it would be absurd. Reason remains a judge. It is simply not the whole court. The modern temptation is to assume that whatever cannot be reached through detached analysis cannot be known at all. Pascal does not dismiss analysis. He argues that detachment is itself a position, valuable for some forms of knowledge and disabling for others. You can learn a great deal about a person from outside a relationship. You cannot learn what it means to trust that person without risking trust. The same structure governs Pascal's approach to God. The philosopher may reason toward a first cause, a necessary being, or a guarantor of knowledge. Such arguments may matter, but the God recorded in the memorial was not an explanatory remainder at the end of a proof. He was joy, certainty, dependence, repentance, and love. Pascal did not merely arrive at a proposition, he found himself addressed. That is why the paper in the coat matters. The world remembers Pascal for calculation. Hidden against his body was the memory of encounter. The pensées preserve the unfinished appeal of a man trying to speak to people still standing outside the door. The memorial preserves the private language of a man who believed, for 2 hours on a November night, that the door had opened. Between them lies the proper meaning of the wager. The wager is neither proof disguised as probability, nor a cheap threat about hell. Pascal uses it to make reason perform one of its highest functions, recognizing where certainty is unavailable, exposing the cost of permanent evasion, and making room for a form of knowledge that reason cannot produce by itself. Pascal's wager does not prove that God is waiting behind the door. It asks whether uncertainty is sufficient reason never to knock.